Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. Today, Conscious Communities is chatting to Iain Dooley about evolved economics and monetary mechanics. And I was put in contact with you, or you contacted me through a guy called Donald, who has been very kindly supplying me with lots of tidbits and information. So a big thank you to Donald for introducing me to Iain and putting this information in front of me. I just want to, first off, Iain, get you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your journey.
Okay, hello everyone. Hello Conscious Communities. My name's Iain Dooley. I live on the central coast of New South Wales in Australia. I am a small business owner in the technology sector, basically just doing computer stuff and the internet. I got interested in economics as a result of being interested in history, and I found online a lot of stuff, a lot of conflicting economic theories, and it seemed odd that there was so much confusion about something which should just be a solved problem. And so that was quite confounding, and for about a year or so I watched a lot of documentaries, the ones I'm sure many of you have watched, the Renegade Horsemen, Renegade Economist, Four Horsemen, Zeitgeist, Addendum, various Money Masters stuff, Neil Ferguson, all that kind of stuff. Eventually I found a book called Management of the Australian Economy from 1979 that had made a lot of sense, and I think that was the first Keynesian stuff I had read. And but I wanted something a little bit more modern, so I searched a modern monetary theory, and there was a thing called modern monetary theory. And so as soon as I read it, I knew that that was the thing that that was missing, that I was really looking for. And so the upshot of that is that every political discussion, as soon as I learned about this theory, every political discussion became absolutely excruciating to listen to. And so I have started a political movement or a political party, yet another minor political party focused on expounding the virtues of modern monetary theory and full employment in the Australian political discourse.
Interesting. Okay, so let's touch a little bit on the aspects about your evolved economics and your theories on this.
Okay, so modern monetary theory is this thing. It's a real thing. It's not a crackpot conspiracy theory. It's a solid body of academic work. If you want to look it up, there's a lot of the main economists are Randall Wray, Stephanie Kelton, Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, and Pavlina Chernova. The Stephanie Kelton was the economic advisor to Bernie Sanders. So this is a little bit mainstream, not quite mainstream, but it's starting to gain some intellectual mind share out there. It's an extension of chartalism, which is quite an old economic theory, and it's sometimes called neo-chartalism. And it's in the sort of dynasty of Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics, sometimes called the heterodox economics, as opposed to orthodox economics. So it's a pretty difficult thing to get your head around, and it's completely different from everything that most people think of as money. And what I've found in explaining this to people is that the easiest thing to, if you can get this, everything else is a logical extension from it. And it's the state theory of money. So if you can understand this, then all of modern monetary theory will just make sense. So there's two basic creation stories of money. The orthodox creation story of money is that everyone was going around trading, trying to trade their sheep for cows and trying to figure out how many sheep is a cow worth. and it was so hard to do. And then they started experimenting with different things, like they would trade clamshells, and then everyone could get clamshells. It was too easy, and eventually they wound up using gold. And then the government came and started meddling in this perfect market that had been created spontaneously, and the government sort of messed everything up, but and demanded taxes and stuff. So that's the orthodox money creation story, that it spontaneously arose as a veil over barter. The more historically accurate version of how money was created is that it was always something that governments created. And that seems a little bit weird to say it. Well, not necessarily governments, but it was always a group construct. It was a legal construct. So the simplest way to explain it, I think, is with an analogy. And if you imagine that you had some kids, your kids at home, and you wanted to get them to do chores, and you put a chart on the kitchen fridge, and you said every time you do a chore, every time you clean your room or clean the bathroom, you get a tick. And if you get 10 ticks, you can have 15 minutes computer games. And there's three things that are really immediately apparent about this system. The first is that the amount of work that can get done is constrained by the number of children you have, not the number of ticks that you can write down. The second is that there's no logical operation where you can borrow a tick. There's no way for you to borrow something that you issue. All you can do is issue new ones. And the third obvious thing about this tick system is, I'm drawing a blank, it's been a long day, that the children can't redeem ticks until the ticks have been awarded. So the spending of ticks must precede the taxation of the ticks, or the redemption of the ticks. So that's what you've created there, is a currency, and it's a currency with a fixed exchange rate to a commodity. And that commodity is the computer. And if you imagine that, there's a couple of things to note about that. So this is like a gold standard, or if you have a currency that's pegged to the US dollar, it's like a fixed exchange rate with an underlying commodity that's convertible. Your currency is convertible to something else. That's something that a lot of people are in favor of these days. They say, oh, we've got this fiat currency, we need it to be convertible to gold in order to give it value. But look at what happens in this situation with a convertible currency. Imagine the computer breaks and it's not available, and the kids turn up to redeem their ticks on that day. If the computer's broken, they can't redeem their ticks, and they might lose faith in the tick system as a result. And so in order to keep them happy, you have to give them free ticks, even though they're not doing any work. And that's interest. So what happens is, if you have a fixed exchange rate, in order to defend the underlying commodity, you can't control your interest rate. So you have to use the interest rate to defend the underlying commodity. And that's what happens with a gold standard. It's what happens with a pegged currency. The other thing that happens, if you imagine that you had 1,000 children, and you could get all the work done that 1,000 children could do, except they won't all have access to the computer. So you've got this situation where you will only be allowed to issue it a certain number of ticks to match the amount of computer time that the kids can use. And so you're going to wind up with kids who are willing and ready to do work, but who are unable to be employed. So if you remove the underlying fixed exchange rate or commodity, then that gives you all the domestic policy space you need in order to pursue full employment. And that's basically where we are in modern Western democracies like the UK and the US and Canada and Australia.
Wow, sorry, I hit my mute button, couldn't get it quickly enough. That's very interesting, because what you're effectively saying is, it's drawing quite a parallel to the employment situation in terms of our sacred labor, and it is a fixed commodity or currency to a particular profession in a way. And for example, we couldn't go and work in a profession that we weren't qualified for, because we don't have the currency or commodity, in sacred labor to work in a different profession. So using the illustration of the kids, it's kind of like you're saying that we don't necessarily have to just be fixed into one way of employment for a specific currency. It should be a more fluid system where we remove the limitations and restrictions that are causing a lot of problems at the moment. Is that where we're going?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing about that is that what we hear from governments all the time is that they can't do something that's in the public interest because they're out of money.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So we have unemployed people, but we can't, and we have work that they could be doing. But the government can't pay them to do that because the government's out of money. The government is going into debt. But if you think back to the tick system, how can the government borrow something that it issues? So if you think about money in that context of a constitutional project, a system that's created by governments to provision resources to the public service, it can never run out of money, but it can run out of resources. Yes. So the amount of work that can get done, the amount of services that can be delivered in the public interest are not constrained by the number of dollars available. As we've seen with quantitative easing, they can create as many trillions of dollars as they want, right?
Yeah.
And it's what matters is the resources available to do work for the public purpose. So I think the most important thing about the children, it's not necessarily that there's a particular way of working or something like that. It's more that if it would be ludicrous in that context, it would seem so illogical to have children who wanted to work and then give them nothing to do because of some arbitrary self-imposed constraint on how many ticks you felt like issuing, or say, oh, like we can only issue the same number of ticks that we redeemed last week. That would be the same as saying that we have to balance our spending with taxation.
That's very interesting. You know, because what you're saying there, it's not about the money because you can print as much as you want. It's about the limitation on resources, which is why, again, I'm really a big advocate of the resource-based economy model because it's a more real currency. It's a more realistic way of working in the world without an imbalance and causing these ridiculous problems.
Yeah, and really at the heart of this is resources. And modern monetary theory holds at its very core, they talk about real resources all the time. What matters is not dollars, but resources, productive capacity. And all the dollars are is a record-keeping mechanism that allows you to organize things well enough that you can have a big functioning system with more than about 20 people. So if you imagine a world without money, then that is by definition just a world without effective record keeping. And it becomes really hard to organize people in big groups to do huge industrial projects like build roads or build the internet. That's really hard to do without liquidity. So money is really just liquidity. And I know that people are really disenchanted with money and the way that money is being used, but it's not an inherent problem of currency or an inherent problem with, the fact that it's dollars, not gold or not silver or whatever. It's just a problem with the policy choices that we've made, political choices that we've made about how we will set our economy up.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant point because there's a huge fear and distrust of money and people go, oh, money is the root of all evil. But in an ideal world, I do believe in a free trade economy and a free trade environment where we're able to, engage in, if I want to get, say, for example, my olive oil from Italy, I should be able to do that. There should be a way for me to exchange some form of currency, be it my sacred labor converted into an actual cash amount. It's again, just a matter of record keeping. What we have at the moment, however, is a system where this financial currency is controlling us through debt-based slavery. And how do we resolve that? How do we move away from that with what you're offering?
Okay, so debt is an interesting thing because there's two types of debt that we talk about. One is government debt, and government debt held in a currency that you issue is not really debt. So there's two things that I need to address here, and they can get kind of complicated. So pull me up if I'm flying off the handle here. The first thing to realize is that if we go back to the chore chart, to the ticks, when I issue a tick, that tick is a liability, is my liability. So that tick says that I owe you some computer time as the child. Now, if you imagine that there's no computer, what do I owe you? It's an exoneration of some obligation. So the real origins of currency way back when, tribal, whatever, it was like tithes to a religious leader or something like that back when we were just, it's like Stone Age stuff. A currency revolves around an obligation that a group has in common. We all owe something, and if we receive a token that exonerates us from that obligation, that token then becomes currency because we all share the same obligation. We know that in future we will have to pay back that thing, so it is worth something to everyone in that group. And that's why, with the exception of the euro, which has been a disaster, we have had almost universally one government, one currency, because currency and sovereignty are almost synonymous. So the money that a government spends is already a liability of that government, which it's like a voucher, a tax credit. It will accept that money back in payment of taxes. So what they call debt at the government level is not really either all money is debt or there is no government debt. So the analogy at the government level is that bonds, the government debt, treasury securities, or whatever you want to call them, are nothing more than term deposits at the central bank. So when you deposit your money at the bank, you now have a $10 deposit, that's your asset, and it's the $10 deposit is the bank's liability. If you then take out a $10 term deposit, the liabilities don't change. The balance sheet doesn't change. But they're now paying you interest on your money. And then it matures and it turns back into normal, non-interest bearing cash. That's what government bonds are. So bond issues and bond sales and all this thing that they call borrowing actually are not a borrowing operation at the central currency issuing government level. So that's the first thing to realize, is that there's a lot of hoo-ha about government debt, and if it's debt held by the currency issuing government denominated in the currency that it issues, then it is not a problem. And you can basically ignore that word for that purpose. You could choose to do it differently, but there is no government debt really. So that's the first thing. Then there's a completely different kind of debt, which is private debt. And that's debt like I took out a loan from the bank. Now that's certainly debt because I don't issue that money. So I have to get the money from somewhere to pay it back. So private credit creation is completely different from what we call government debt. They're just completely different things. We do have a really big problem. I should say, explicitly say that if the government issues debt in a currency that it does not issue, that's a big problem as well. So for example, if Brazil has a huge the Brazilian government has a huge debt in US dollars, that's a problem because it has to get the US dollars from somewhere. So then it has to export all this stuff that, like it has food that its people needs the food, right? But they need the dollars to settle the debts, and that's a really big problem. So Australia, Canada, USA, UK, Japan, none of those governments have debt issued in a currency that they do not issue. So there's a lot of problems with third world debt denominated in US dollars. That's a separate problem. So I'm talking about sort of modern Western democracies. So in the private debt stakes, that's a huge issue because when the private sector goes into debt, they have to pay it back eventually. And they're going to have to pay it back, and it's going to weaken demand in the economy when they pay it back, and it's going to collapse. Like the whole thing is going to collapse. So allowing what the governments have done is they've cut spending and deregulated finance. And the reason that that worked for a little while is that it allowed the finance sector to pick up the slack for creating demand in the economy. Spending, economic activity was created on borrowed money using private credit. But there's only so much private credit that people can accrue. So unless the government increases its spending to reduce the private sector debt, then you have a massive collapse. So basically what we need from the government is to regulate banking properly so that they don't lend so excessively, but at the same time the governments need to inject more spending into the economy to keep up the demand. So it's how's that going? It's a pretty hairy topic.
I've got it, but then how do you keep the corruption out of that? I mean, because that is the ultimate problem, isn't it?
Yeah, corruption at what level? Corruption in the private credit creation, bank regulation level?
Well, we all know that millions of dollars of taxpayer money goes missing into black projects and into back pockets and all sorts of things like that. And that, you know, these things, these black projects are used against us, satellite spying and all kinds of things, NSA, do all that kind of stuff. And that's where the funding comes from. We pay for it. We're paying for our own enslavement. It's because the funding that we pay as taxes literally goes into the bullets and bombs that kill people. So there is a lot of corruption in terms of how the money is mismanaged, which is where, you know, yeah, money can be used for a lot of good, but can also be used corruptly. And therein lays the problem. How do we avoid, with an ideal system of, you know, free trade and working as you suggest, how would you suggest we work with eliminating that corruption or the corrupt element?
Okay, so there's a couple of things there. First of all, I wouldn't call that corruption. It's different from corruption because people are voting for it. It's just ignorance on behalf of voters. So we need, people will vote for fascist policies when they feel afraid. And the reason people feel afraid and anxious is because they are in economic peril. They've been left behind. We've had 3 jobless recoveries. The last 3 boom and bust cycles have had jobless recoveries, which means that all of the recovery money, all of the money in the growth after the bust has gone to the top 0.1% of people. So real wages growth has been stagnant, and everyone is freaked out by that, and so they accept. Then the government's kind of like scapegoat terrorists, and there's this whole story about how we need to be kept safe, and people feel scared, so they make poor decisions. What I think is the remedy to that is that if we make people feel taken care of, then they will start to feel more compassionate, and they will be less likely to vote for warlike policies, and they'll be less willing to accept intrusions into their civil liberties for things that are not really that big a threat to them at that time, when there's a whole lot of doublespeak going on. So I think that what you're saying about the black ops and the NSA and the spying, that's definitely a reality, but people are voting for it. It's not corruption. It's just what people are voting for. So we have to look at why are people feeling that way, and that's isolation. It's isolation and fear, created by a lack of community, created by a lack of connection, created by a sense of us and them. And to me, all of that stuff has its roots in how we organize our economy. Do we leave each other behind? Do we have an individualistic economy where there's no safety net? You know, particularly in the US, where there's really people will just get left out in the cold, literally out in the cold, to die. And no society should be like that. And if you create a society like that, then that's when you get this real sense of anxiety and fear, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're bang on there. There's just a few things, obviously, that concern me here, which is you're talking very much about politics as if it actually has anything to do with affecting change, and like the way we vote for things affects the way politicians enact. When what I've kind of come to realize, it doesn't matter what we vote for; they'll do what they want anyway. And if we don't vote the right way when they have a referendum, they'll make us vote again.
Have you seen the research on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The Lisbon with Ireland, when Ireland had to choose to be part of the euro or not, they voted no. And of course, the people who controlled everything weren't very happy with that, so they made Ireland vote again and basically pushed them into a yes vote. I don't even know if it was a legitimate vote. And the whole voting thing is a bit of a joke. I know I come from South Africa, where it's so heavily corrupted that it doesn't matter who you vote for, they will put into power whichever political party is being controlled by the shadow government. It's the citizens have very little control over anything, or have very little say in anything. If anything, we're brainwashed and manipulated by media into certain perceptions to go along with the status quo. It's got nothing to do with what we demand or the policies that we vote for. And that's my personal belief. I really just don't believe that politics can affect any change, because it doesn't matter both sides of the political spectrum, or all sides of the political spectrum. Certainly the major parties have elements of control from outside shadow governments. It's the way they've controlled the world.
There's this really, so what you just expressed there about that it doesn't matter what we vote for because it's the policies that get enacted are the ones that benefit people, the finance industry, is actually borne out. There's research. It's for the US, but it's specific research done that shows, there's this cool graph that just shows how policies should have been enacted if voting by the populace made a difference, and how they were enacted based on the preferences of the financial elites.
Yeah.
And it shows that there's a huge amount of control by finance in the American political system. And I would say probably that extends to other political systems, but this research is specifically for the US. And there's this amazing YouTube video, which I would recommend everyone watch. The funny thing is this YouTube video looks like just totally one of those crackpot conspiracy theory videos, but it's not. It's really good stuff. It's called The Cardboard Box Reform. And this guy talks about that research, and he talks about all of this stuff that started to really go haywire in the late 70s. He's like, why did the late 70s? What happened in the late 70s? And, the late 70s is actually when neoliberalism took over. It was when a whole lot of financial deregulation started, environmental destruction, just all of these things simultaneously. And he's just sort of aghast at looking at what's the common thing here. And it's an astounding, I don't know if I want to spoil it. It's just so good. But anyway, I'll tell you what it is. It's, because otherwise, like, what are we talking about? But watch it anyway. It's really good. He says that there was this act, this really minor thing called the Legislative Reorganization Act that Nixon signed in at some point. And all it did was make voting in the Congress more transparent, which sounds really great. But if you look at the reason why we have secret ballots in a democracy, prevent vote buying, intimidation, and coercion. So as soon as the transparency increased in the Congress, that meant that, and he kind of has these accounts from people who were in Congress before and after this change, that they said they would go to these donors and say, yeah, sure, I'll vote for the thing with the environmental destruction. I'll totally do that. And they would take their money. Then they would go and vote against it. But the business that they were getting the money from would have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
But after this change, they had to actually follow through in order to get the money. So it's a really amazing journey. You should go and check it out. But basically, this thing which sounded like a great idea, because who doesn't want increased transparency, turns out to be a tremendously bad idea because it increased corruption. And before this change, there was no lobbying. The lobbying wasn't really even an industry. The lobbyists were just these kind of like Biff Loman, Death of a Salesman guys, these desperate guys begging in Congress going, oh, come on, please. But then after that, the lobbyists became this whole industry, and they're really wealthy now because there's so much money to be made by government lobbying. So that's a really interesting thing. And so, yes, it's a totally corrupted system in some respects now, in particular because finance has gotten very, very big and very, very powerful. And no industry should get that big or that powerful. But I think that the solution is political, and that it has to be grassroots awareness, that we need to put this, really, the root of it all is neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is the thing that has the orthodox money creation story. It says that the government is interfering with markets, that governments should be small and not spend much. And the opposite is true. We want the government to provide services. It's just that we want them to provide the right services. And we want the governments have to have a role in providing full employment, because no private sector in the history of money has ever created enough jobs for everyone. So those are really important messages to get out, because there's a lot of confusion around economics. And as long as that confusion prevails, the remedy will not be within our grasp. But if we can get a widespread understanding of what governments should be doing for us, and that we shouldn't just abandon governments and say, oh, I don't trust governments anymore, therefore it's not a political solution. It has to be a political solution, but it's something that needs to come from the bottom up.
I totally agree. I think the whole system needs an overhaul, and definitely the way politicians go about things. We definitely need representatives and people who can articulate the needs of the public well, and who have ways in which they can organize themselves to see that projects are followed through on, particularly those with regards to immediate needs such as hospitals, housing, food. We need to have responsible people in charge of things like that, looking after things like that, not just willy-nilly that hope everybody's going to help build a hospital when someone gets sick. There has to be structure and organization. Absolutely. We've had a look at how disastrous some of this free man movement and free money cult things have happened in the truth movement, and it has turned a bit Lord of the Flies. We've realized we can't completely abandon all systems, but we just have to somehow find a way to evolve into a less corrupt system that doesn't perpetuate the suffering of humanity for the purposes of profit, I think is really where we would need to be heading. I don't think it's necessarily a financial failure, economic failure, it's a people failure, it's a corruption.
Well, if you think about it, think about some of the conservative or regressive policies that people vote for or people get on board for all the time. So things that limit other people's freedoms, or that punish people or perpetuate cycles of poverty. The reason that people vote for those things or accept those things, the reason that they're popular, is because we have a fiscal system set up that behaves as if I have to rob you in order to support this person, or that it's your taxes that are paying for this person's welfare, or your taxes are paying for this woman's abortion, so therefore you have a right to tell her how to live her life. The reality is that government taxation creates fiscal space for the government to spend in the public purpose, but does not need to be matched one-to-one with spending. So tax dollars aren't really a thing, because when you pay taxes, the money just disappears. Taxes don't really fund government spending, but they do create fiscal space for the government to spend without inflation risk. So if we change the economic understanding, then we remove the incentive for people to punish one another. We stop pitting one sector of society against another sector of society. Because at the moment, we've got these people that say, oh, well, they're on welfare and I pay my taxes, and that breeds this real resentment. Or we have people who accept that we can't provide services because we have to pay off the government debt. And so people vote for they vote for spending cuts, they vote for austerity, even though it's not in their interest. So it creates this kind of cruel zero-sum game, which is completely unnecessary. So I think that the human failure that you're referring to is at its core an economic failure. But it's a cruel trick that was played on us by a small group of economists in the late 70s. Art Laffer and Milton Friedman, they got in the ear of Reagan and Thatcher, and the last 40 years have been a result of that change. And if that we can, but the thing is, we had a better, more compassionate, happier society. It was regressive in some ways, like there was a lot less equality in terms of gender equality and race equality. But if we combine the progress we've made on those fronts with the potential for a more compassionate economic understanding, then it will be a different kind of world that we live in.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know where next you want to go from here. I suppose tell us a little bit more about how you've extended your research, and you're talking a bit about bringing together different political groups. What are you talking to them about, and what are you suggesting to them?
Well, yeah, so I've here in Melbourne today met with a few different political parties in Australia, minor parties and independent candidates, meeting with a couple more over the next couple of days. Basically, I want to try and use functional finance or modern monetary theory as a unifying economic framework that can draw together a lot of common ground in the progressive agenda. So I was, we were discussing before that the right of the political spectrum really tends to coalesce, and the left tends to divide. Because on the left end of the spectrum, there's a lot of different ideas, and everyone gets excited about their own idea, but there's no common framework within which to sit it. Whereas on the right side of the political spectrum, there's a real coalescence around otherness and nationalism and sort of scapegoating of particular minority groups or whatever. So that provides them with the basis for their common ground. And the left end of the progressive end of the political spectrum doesn't have the same thing. So what I want to try and do is use functional finance, this new economic understanding, as a common framework for people to work together. And sure, we're going to have differences of opinion, but if we start from the same strategic basis, which is that money is a thing that is just purely to be used as a tool for organizing social projects, that we decide what we want society to look like, and the economics is used as a tool to make that happen, rather than the model we have now, which is we are kind of slaves to the economy. We treat the economy as if it's an independent thing, that we have to do what it says, but the opposite is true. So that's something I think that could provide a common thread for a lot of progressive movements. I have been researching. If anyone wants to get involved in researching this and finding out about it, MMT and modern monetary theory there's a lot of stuff about it on the internet now. If you're in Australia, look up Australian Employment Party on Facebook or Google or YouTube or iTunes, and we've got a podcast as well. So, and then also if you're on Facebook, look up Intro to MMT, I think it might be called Intro to Modern Monetary Theory as a Facebook group. Yeah, look at YouTube videos. I've got on my YouTube channel, I've got some MMT explainer videos that sort of try to break things down into a very simple kind of piecemeal way of explaining it. It's a really challenging topic though, so people are going to have to go on their own journey of discovery. The most challenging part about it, and we touched on this before, the most challenging part about it is how does banking fit in with this?
Yes.
Because a lot of what we hear, a lot of what is in the sort of economic truth-seeking community, like the Zeitgeist stuff, the Positive Money UK stuff, really focuses on the role that banks play. Yes, we need to regulate banks better. And banks should not be as big as they are, basically. They should be small and they should serve a public purpose. And banks aren't supposed to be these huge profitable monsters. They're just supposed to be boring little finance things. So we have to make finance boring again. That's my like Donald Trump style slogan for it. Let's make finance boring again. So I just wanted to clarify, because I don't think I got as far as I needed to with private banking. I just want to clarify one little thing. Private banks create deposits. The use of the word money is it's problematic because there's lots of different types of money. And what banks create are deposits that are valid at that bank. Anytime money moves outside of that bank, it has to be converted into notes and coins or reserve balances at the central bank to settle up between private banks. So banks can create money, but what they really create are deposits denominated in the national unit of account. So they create deposits denominated in Australian dollars, but they're different. The Australian dollars that the bank creates are not government money. They're not reserves and they're not notes and coins. The reason that banks can create so much more money so much more deposits than the reserves they have is because they only need to settle up with each other once a day. So at the end of the day, they settle up whatever the difference is in transactions between the two banks. So if you imagine that there was $1 million of transactions going one way and $999,999 going the other way between two banks, they would only need $1 in reserves to settle up. So constraining that is a government policy decision, and we need to start holding our governments accountable for regulating finance properly, because finance is not the economy. The stock market is not the economy. Banks do not have a right to be big profitable monsters. There's no reason for banks to be even profitable. Like there's no reason for banks to be anything other than what we want them to be. So I want to sort of like disarm a little bit the image of banks as being like these powerful things. They've gotten out of control a little bit, but they do serve a purpose. They just need to be regulated properly. And it's us that tells our governments how to regulate banking. And the more people can understand that there's no inherent natural order of things that says we have to have, the stock market has to be a certain way, or that foreign exchange rates have to do a certain thing, or that banks, if we interfere with banks, the whole market would that ruins everything because the government can't interfere with banks. It ruins some sort of pure market thing. It's all complete baloney. And that's the type of fear language that the finance industry uses to keep people in line and voting against their own best interests. So I just wanted to finish off with that, a little bit about private banking. It's not that special, and we can take it on.
Good. It's very interesting. And I like your realistic approach to this, because what you're offering is an actual tangible structure and solution that's achievable within our current parameters without, completely bringing the entire system to a halt, which...
Right, yeah, using it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need that bridge. We need that bridging mechanism. And you said very, very interestingly there, a lot of these a lot of these institutions are just sort of invested in self-preservation, which what I really see as necessary is a complete evolving structure, the willingness always to benefit, not to self-preserve, to benefit the greater good, benefit humanity, as you say, serve as an account, a record-keeping office. That's what they are, as opposed to,
Let's make it that boring.
Yeah.
Finance has become this glorified thing. Like everyone's excited about finance. Our best and brightest go to work in investment banks. Come on. It's the most boring thing in the world. They should be doing something interesting.
So true. My husband is one of the most talented people I've ever known. He was an investment banker when I met him. You know,
Yeah.
no, it's a crazy world.
And it's an industry that produces nothing. It's an industry. So I think that there's this really amazing series of videos. And they're really long and boring, but they're super academic, and they're really high quality academic research. This guy named Randall Ray. If you go on YouTube and you search Randall Ray, and Ray is spelled W-R-A-Y, Randall Ray Macroeconomics, there's a playlist of 8 lectures that he gave, and they're all about 2 or 3 hours long. Lectures 6 and 7 are they're the actual finance reform agenda one. So the rest of it is like the history of macroeconomics throughout the ages. Then he has these 2 that are about, a real offering of how to reform finance. And the point that he makes is that finance, all it's supposed to do is help us organize money a little bit, like the record keeping office. At the moment, something like 40% of all the GDP goes into finance. So how dumb is it to have us set up a system where this thing is that is supposed to be an auxiliary component of the economy is taking up 40% of all the economic activity?
Yeah, interesting. And very much causing a huge amount of problems. I mean, they have the power to remove people from their homes,
Yeah, right. Especially, actually, he talks about this in that lecture, especially in the US. They changed the record-keeping mechanism for deed titles and everything, and foreclosures. So it became really easy for banks to accidentally foreclose people's houses. And it happens quite a bit. So they used to have this whole public record keeping system. So if someone turned up to your house and said, "Hey, that's my house. You owe me, or you owe me money for that house," you'd be like, "No, I don't. Look at this public record. This is my house, and I don't owe you any money." But this, and it differs between states. That's the other problem in the US. They've got this, every state has a different thing. But in lots of different states, banks can make a clerical error and foreclose on your house. And there's nothing in the public record that allows you to refute that. And it's happened on numerous occasions, and I can't imagine anything worse than that. It just is an atrocity. So that this sort of free market ideology about how governments should not interfere in things and governments are inefficient has just been a disaster for every aspect of our lives.
Yeah. Well, we do need some sort of form of structure. It just needs to be more beneficial to humanity.
Yeah.
Biggest examples, and I keep coming back to this, is the most wealthy and the most powerful, the most prestigious, the royal families of the world. And I live in Holland. For example, the Dutch royal family who own Royal Dutch Shell, and being one of the biggest polluters on the planet. The oil industry is the biggest polluter on the planet. Got massive lawsuits going on with the oil spill going on in Nigeria and the disaster it's done there. And yet no one's bringing these people to account, the people who actually are causing the most damage, the bankers, the people behind these big companies who just have the money to shell out for these kind of things. There does have to be some kind of, clean up the mess you've made, mechanism put in place. And there is a responsibility on behalf of the financial industry to, in some way, get involved in doing that.
Yeah, the amount to which the level to which we allow industries to externalize their costs is ridiculous. And ironically, we have this kind of catch cry of governments that, we're going into debt, right, which isn't debt at all. It's just like what government debt is just a private sector financial asset. They have that, that US debt clock, and it's supposed to scare everyone, that you could just call that, instead of US debt, you would call it private sector savings. Like, that debt's money in your pocket. You do not want that paid back. So everyone says, we're going to debt. Our children will have to repay this burden and all that kind of stuff. The actual debt, the most succinct way of saying this is that a nation cannot save for its future in dollars. Because if you imagine that we had retirees, say you had a nation of 100 million people, and they were all exactly the same age, and they had all saved all their money. And there was one person who was a teenager, and everyone turned retirement age on the same day, and there was only one person left to do work. All the money in the world will not change the fact that there's only one person left to do the work. So you can't save the nation cannot save for its future in dollar terms. It can only save for the future in terms of production capacity and resources and environment and people and skills. So having a company which pollutes the environment that totally externalizes that cost, that's the real debt that our grandchildren will have to repay. There's no worries about the debt, the $20 trillion they keep talking about in the election or whatever. That's fine. That is a non-issue. The actual debt is the infrastructure, the crumbling infrastructure, and the forests are getting clear-felled at the rate of 1,000 hectares a day or whatever it is. That's the real debt. So people have to start thinking about resources and not money. And that money is just a record-keeping mechanism for resources, because that's that thinking, that debt-based thinking. Say, oh, we've got this debt. It's the externalities that we allow companies to get away with that are the real debt burden on future generations.
Yes, well said. That's a brilliant note to end this on, Iain. Before we do go, though, is there anything else you'd like to add to this?
No, that's it. That's great. I look forward to catching up with conscious communities. I didn't know about you guys, so keen to find out more.
You're welcome. Conscious Consumer Network is our television network. It's a free and independent media network, and Conscious Communities is the show that you're going to have your interview broadcast on. And yeah, we're very, very grateful for the information download, because it's practical from a sense of there's a lot of pie in the sky as to, let's just get rid of everything, be free and live on an island and run around nude and, not have any infrastructure, which is all very good and well. But, the planes will drop out the sky if everyone just gets down to the coast.
Yeah, this is a very practical solution, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's something that when I found it, I had been looking in, as I said, I've been looking into economics for a year or something, and I hadn't seen anything that seemed realistic to me.
Yeah.
And as soon as I found this one, I was like, okay, boom, this is the real deal. I can work with this.
And do you have a website or an online reference point for all of this information?
Well, so yeah, it's a bit disparate at the moment. So if you go to the Australian Employment Party website, it's australianemploymentparty.org, then I've got a YouTube channel linked from that, and I've got a podcast, and I've got in that YouTube channel there's these explainer videos that kind of my attempt at summarizing MMT. Everything else, if people search Pavlina Job Guarantee Vimeo, Pavlina Job Guarantee Vimeo. There's New Economic Perspectives blog from Randall Wray and the Levy Institute. There's Billy blog, Bill Mitchell. If you search Bill Mitchell, Billy blog, you'll find it. The problem is, and also there's the seminal work, the book that if you read it and want to understand this deeply and have a spare 6 weeks, then you should read the book Modern Money Theory by Randall Wray. It's W-R-A-Y. And also there's another one, free PDF, if you search 7DIF, 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, so 7DIF Mosler PDF, and Mosler is M-O-S-L-E-R. Those are the basics. Those are the basic texts of this theory. And there's tons of stuff on YouTube. Stephanie Kelton, just go to YouTube and search Stephanie Kelton, and you'll see the talks that she's given. Go to YouTube and search Randall Wray. Does a lot of stuff on YouTube as well. Bill Mitchell, if you search Bill Mitchell demystifying MMT on YouTube. So there's a lot of stuff. Like basically, if I arm people with the names and concepts, and they look in Google and YouTube, they'll find it. But I've been trying to frame this in a less academic kind of package on my YouTube channel and my podcast. So hopefully that helps someone out. But there's no one single organization or website that is like the definitive intro to monetary theory yet. Maybe we'll work on that one.
Excellent. All right, let us know if we can do to help you. But in the meantime, Iain, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your contribution of information. And we'll catch up with you again.
Okay, thanks, Mel. See you later.
Thank you for tuning into CCN. This unique network is dedicated to free and independent media. CCN was created with the belief that information is the common heritage of all beings, which is why our live stream high-definition broadcast is easily accessible and free to view. If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Having produced over 1,000 shows in 2015, which are all archived on YouTube, we look forward to bringing you more groundbreaking, cutting-edge information in 2016. For more information on what is on, please check out our broadcast guide for weekly updates. CCN broadcasts in multiple languages and features some key voices of our challenging times who are all in pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world. CCN belongs to you, the people, and it is up to you all to keep this network on the air. Please contribute to the Network Support Fund or visit the CCN shop. We thank you all for supporting free and independent media.